Hey there, I'd like to thank you for clicking on this video, and I hope you're ready to learn about loops in Java. Now, first, before we go into how we use loops and what loops are, I just want to note the importance of them. You can use loops when you're first beginning in Java programming to all the way when you're a super advanced programmer. You can use them really any language. They're very essential for coding because they let you run code multiple times over without having to repeat yourself. Repeating yourself can get really tedious and it's a time waster, so you can use loops to maximize your output. So here are the video timestamps if you want to skip ahead to anything. We're going to go over 4 different kinds of loops today. And these are really the main ones when we talk about loops for beginning Java programming. We have a for loop, which is your basic loop. You have a for each loop, which comes into play when we're talking about using arrays. We have a while loop, and we have a do while loop. So the first loop we're going to be talking about is a for loop here. Now there are a few parts to the condition in the for loop. First, we start out by naming what kind of loop it is, and then in our condition, we first need a reference variable. Now, this is going to be something like a number or int I equals 0, for example. This is probably the most common one that I see. I'll show you an example of how to code this in 1 second, but I wanted to talk about each of the parts before we get into it. So the reference variable, like I said, is going to keep track of where we are in our loop. We can reference different incrementations in our loop body. Now we separate each of these 3 parts with a semicolon here. Our next part is a condition, and that is going to be specifying how many times we loop or the end of the loop. And this is going to be something like I is greater than or equal to x or 10 or some other variable that tells us how many times we're supposed to loop over. Next, the incrementation is increasing the reference variable so it meets this condition. So if we start at 0 for the reference variable, we're going to increment it each loop so it meets the condition and ends the loop. Now this part of the code is the body, and this is where you're going to put all your functional code. So whatever that may be, you'll put it in here to execute each time the loop runs. So I have our online IDE set up here with just a basic hello world print line, and we're going to be looping this to see how the for loop works. So you set it up just like I had in the slide. You start it off with a for and you start your condition. Now we have to have the reference variable. So since we don't have any other variables set up here, we're going to make our own and initialize and declare it. So we're going to use int I equals 0. So that sets up a variable whose value is equal to 0, and we'll change that throughout the loop. Now we separate the condition here with our semicolons. A good thing to remember is this I reference variable is temporary, so we don't really want to use it outside of our for loop here because the value always changes, but we can use it inside the for loop to track which loop we're on. Now comes the condition here, so if I wanted to run the loop 10 times, I could say I is less than 10, so that would be the end of the loop. And this value right here can be anything. It's just going to be, well, as long as it's an integer, it's going to mark when it ends. So if I had another variable up here, I'll write number of students, and we'll just set that equal to 10. So now I can put num students here, and then it would still run however many times we have here. And a good thing about using outside variables like this is if I changed it to 1, it would still work. It would just execute 1 time. So I wouldn't have to go back and change all my functional code here. So the third part of this loop is to increment. So we would do I++, and that would increment I by 1, so it would add up to whatever number num students is and then stop. So that is our case that's set up. So now we can see how many times this executes, and I'm just going to put I here so we can see which loop we're actually running, and we'll wait for it to load. And there we go. So it pops up that it runs 10 times. And of course, it starts on 0 here because that's what I is. We use this value for I in our body part of the code here, and we increment it after. So that's why it's still at 0 in our first loop, and it hasn't been incremented to 1 already. Now moving on, we're going to be talking about the for each loop. What the for each loop does is it takes what we have in the for loop, except we're using an array and a variable instead of our 3 conditions. This is good if you're trying to use each element in an array of strings or an array of objects, something along those lines. We can use each of those objects in the array without having to call the index in our body here. Now we'll set up our array here, and we'll just call it R, and I'll set up my array of strings of, let's see, different car brands. So I'll go Ford, Toyota, GMC, and let's see, what's another brand? Lexus. We'll do Lexus here. So I have 4 brands right here that I want to print out in a string. Well, if I didn't have a string, I have to do system.out.println again. And I would have to go through each index in the array here. So starting at 0, because remember, the arrays count from 0 and onwards, so it's going to go 0, 1, 2, 3. So we would go array spot 0, array spot 1, array spot 2, and array spot 3. And that would print all of them out as long as I have the right syntax there. And once it prints out, it's going to print out all of the car brands that we have in our array. And it doesn't even have spaces. If I wanted to do spaces, I would have to come in here and manually add a space in for each one of them. And to speed that process up, I could just do a little copy and paste here. And then wait for it to load again. Print out like that with spaces in between them. Now, as you can see, that took a while. And if I wanted to make any adjustments to that, I'm going to have to rewrite the entire thing or add in another. If I had more cars in my array, I would have to add more to my print line. Well, instead of doing that, I can use a for loop or for each loop this time. And for my array, I can go in and I can say I want a string, and the string reference variable is going to be X, and I can separate this and send in our array. So now I open up the body here. So now what this is going to do is it's going to send in our array into this loop, and it's going to put, for each variable in our array, it's going to run the loop once and save whatever index we're on in the loop. So the first time it runs, second time it runs, third time it runs, it's going to save that in string X right here. So now when I do system.out.println and I say print out X, there we go. And if I wanted them how it printed out the first time, I could just take away this line and add a space in right there. So now it would print it out all in one line with a space in between them. Well, you might be thinking it takes about the same time as writing it all out, so what's the point? Well, if I had a completely different array in here, say I had an int array, and we had some numbers in here, I would have to go through each one of these and make sure it prints out this new array, and we have to make sure it's called a different array. So I'm going to have to go through that whole line and make sure it prints out each index in array 2. Well, instead of doing that, I can go in here and just change our variable to an integer, because that is what's in this array. And I send array 2 in. Now it's going to print out all the numbers instead, and I didn't have to rewrite the entire hard-coded line. See, there we go, printed out all of our lines. And a while loop is a loop that runs the condition first and then executes the body after. Now the difference between a for loop and a while loop is that we don't have our incrementation in the condition here. We only have a single condition similar to an if statement with a single comparison. So we could have variable x is greater than or equal to variable y. Now, if we use a greater to condition, the condition is never going to change, so it's going to be an infinite loop. So in our body, we have to include an incrementation, like adding 1 to x or adding 1 to y to end the loop. Otherwise, your code is going to break in an infinite loop. So now we'll set up our while loop, and we're going to use number or num students. And we'll say if that's greater than 0, we will run it. Now this way it would be easier to call each of these students than using an if loop, just because it saves time. Because the students aren't in an array and they're just an index number. So it would be easier to use a while loop than a for loop. So we could do this here, where we could go system.out.println. And we could say what could we say? We could say the number of students left is, and we would have that at the end there. And we could do now another thing we have to remember is to add our incrementation. So we'll go number of students just decrement it there, and that will take away 1 from our students each loop. So now if we run it here, we won't get an infinite loop, and it should count down from 10 down to 1. Yep. And say we took away the decrement here, what would happen? Well, there's nothing to stop the loop, so it'll just keep going on forever and just stay at 10. And that'll overload your system and cause your program to crash, so you definitely don't want to do that. So we'll stop the console right there, and we'll definitely add that back in here. Alright, so get that back in there, and it'll go from 10 down to 1 again. Now, I could also change where the decrement is. So if I have it before it prints out the number of students, it'll start at 9 and end at 0. Because we're decreasing it by 1 before we print it out. Now, do while loop is a little bit different than that. It's going to execute the body first, which still must include an incrementation, and check the condition after. And this is important because we use this if we know we want to execute something once, and then it's going to depend on our variable after that, right? Because say we didn't have any students in our count last time, in our integer. Well, it would never run this body. Where in this case, in a do while loop, it's going to run it first and then check how many students we have. So this is a little bit safer if you want to run it first and then check. And all we would have to do to change that here is to move the statement to the bottom and make sure you have your do up top. And then you do have to put a semicolon at the end of the line here because it's outside of the curly brackets. So now we still have our decrement here. We still have the printing out function. So we'll run that and it'll have the same outcome as the other one. It just checks the condition after it prints it out just to make sure we get that 1 in there if the students was 0. And we can actually show you that by saying, oh, well, the number of students is 0 from the start. And you can see that it takes 1 away even though the number is 0 here. So obviously in our case it really wouldn't make sense to have a negative number of students, but in some cases it would make sense to do that. And that is the end of our Java tutorial for loops. I hope you learned something and I hope you enjoyed watching. Hopefully there'll be more videos coming out soon, so just comment whatever you want to learn about next below, and I'll see you then.